All right. Thank you, everyone, for returning for our afternoon session on nuclear energy advocacy and how and why we want to be doing that in this age. We have two very special guests from the US, Mark Nelson and Paris Ortiz-Wines, and Joe Lackenby, very special guest from Sydney, one of the 170 stations around Sydney. So this is going to be a fireside chat. I'll ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and how they got into nuclear energy advocacy and what they do now. And then we'll talk a little bit more broadly and take some questions from you all. So let's go this way. Mark.
Yeah. Hey everybody, I'm from Oklahoma, which is a land of oil and natural gas and now wind turbines. There's cattle. It's basically Australia. And another thing it has in common with Australia is a dearth of nuclear energy. So I grew up not thinking about nuclear energy. I had many opportunities to discover it. They kept looking backwards. They pound me in the face when I look. Like I went to Los Alamos as a child. It's fascinating. I later worked as an engineering student in Los Alamos. I chose engineering to study, but didn't want to be involved in oil and gas like my father and his father before him, because I was going to clean up the energy, and oil and gas wasn't good enough for me. My mother is in nuclear medicine, so that's boring. So over and over, I just keep seeing these chances where I might have discovered it. First time I ever went to Europe was to study Russian for the summer in St. Petersburg, one of the biggest cities in the world, almost exclusively powered by nuclear energy. Not just any nuclear, we're talking RBMK, so that, Chernobyl types. That's fascinating, and I never thought about it. Nobody ever mentioned it, never heard anything about it there. Spent a second summer there, still didn't come up. I also visited the museum in Kiev about Chernobyl. Fascinating, didn't scare me, but was absolutely fascinating. Not enough to think of nuclear energy. Was in Japan, so went to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. That didn't do it either. So I get all the way up to needing to choose a direction in life. I have a scholarship that I got from an oil man to go to Cambridge, any subject. And still, I'm completely baffled what I want to do with my life. Maybe something clean energy, and I just can't figure out what. One evening, I see a YouTube video from a quiet, mild-mannered, totally volunteer nuclear advocate who works alone in Alberta, Canada. His name is Gordon McDowell, and he decided that there should be a talk on nuclear at his little TEDx in Calgary. And he invited a man named Kirk Sorensen, who's got this crazy new reactor design that they don't want you to know about. And he edited Kirk's talk, put it on YouTube, and I've met an entire generation of young people who, like me, saw that video and immediately knew what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives. That was in winter 2011, 2012. Cambridge had just started a nuclear engineering program. I immediately chose it, threw in an application, got in, went on scholarship. The rest is almost history. So yeah, little tiny chance encounters matter. Even the big chance encounters that should have pointed me towards nuclear didn't. It was the advocates, the volunteer advocates working without recognition alone, that are making the sparks that lead to the world we see today and us sitting in front of you. Maybe I'll say more about that 10-year gap between 2012 starting in Cambridge and now. Later, I'm going to hand this off to Paris.
Hi, everybody. My name is Paris Ortiz-Wines, and I work with Mark in the advocacy space. I'm from California, grew up in a very beautiful small beach town, and I am a second-generation Mexican-American, so I grew up in a household where we would have to turn the water off when brushing our teeth, when we're washing the dishes. Sometimes if we're in a drought, I'd put a bucket in the shower so that I can water the plants. During summertime, we would put our clothes up on a clothesline. So I grew up with this, and so when I came across climate change in City College, I became obsessed and felt like, why hadn't anybody been talking about this? And everybody therefore needed to live how I grew up. And we all needed to do this, undergo a massive cultural shift. We're going to use less, and we're going to redeem ourselves for our sins, and it's going to be great. I will admit I was a bit hopeless, angry, and frustrated. And when I stumbled upon a small energy nonprofit, environmental nonprofit, they were focusing on nuclear energy. And because of my age, I'm in the millennial generation, I had no previous knowledge of nuclear. I thought, I didn't even know our state had nuclear plants. I just immediately thought of weapons. But when I saw the TED Talk, Why I Changed My Mind About Nuclear by Michael Schellenberger, I was like, yeah, that sounds great. Like for me, it was a no-brainer. Nuclear was a hope. And I was looking for a way to take my individual actions and also dismantle this capitalistic evil structure, and nuclear seemed to fit the bill. I could advocate for it individually, but also produce a systematic change that I could literally look at the numbers and say it's going to employ this many people, it's going to avoid this amount of emissions, and it's going to produce power 24/7. And so for me, it was like, great. And coming from the environmental side, it was the advocates. So I was like, these are my people. These are the ones that want to make a change. Advocacy is a wide range. You could be an internet warrior, or you could be out there like Extinction Rebellion. There's something for everybody. So for me, I was able to bring back to my family and actually have a digestible solution and way to connect it to their lives. Energy is the foundation of society, and electricity prices are something that we talk about. What's happening in California? And so that's how I've been on the journey, and we've done many campaigns, including in Diablo Canyon and in California, saving our last nuclear plant, been abroad to Germany and Belgium. I just think this was, for me, like Mark, it was like, this is my life's mission. Nuclear's the way. Also to you.
Hi everybody, I'm Jo Lackenby. I'm very jealous because unlike these two, I'm a part-time nuclear advocate. I do have a day job. You guys have day jobs too, doing what you love doing. I'm a chartered professional engineer, so in environmental engineering and risk engineering. So by day, sorry.
Oh, no, just go on.
So by day I have a job, but I do, as a volunteer, go out and advocate for nuclear energy when I can. I find it one of the most stressful things that I do in life, especially in this political arena we have in Australia at the moment, with two very opposing positions from the two sides of government. I became an environmental engineer because I wanted to find practical solutions to pollution problems. And when I was an undergraduate engineer in the last year of uni, we had to do a thesis project. There was a big long list of topics and none of them appealed to me, but I had a bit of an interest in nuclear waste. So I thought, maybe I can go to ANSTO and do my undergraduate thesis on waste, because what about the waste? And I came out of that thinking, oh, it's not so bad really. Fast forward a few years and I did get a position at ANSTO, and I was there for about 15 years. ANSTO was very good at encouraging their employees to go to places like Vienna, to go and learn, to go to conferences. And they were very strong in promoting an organisation called Women in Nuclear Australia. So when I was working at ANSTO, I got to go to the World Nuclear University, right, which is as cool as it sounds. I've been in ANSTO for about two or 3 years, and I nominated to go, and they paid for me to go. And this is 6 weeks in the UK. It was at Oxford, to go and learn all about the nuclear industry, 130 odd people under the age of 35, right? You could imagine lots of learning, lots of partying, lots of fun. But on this trip, we went through the whole fuel cycle except for the uranium mine. So we got to go to reprocessing facilities, fuel generation facilities, enrichment facilities, and to my first nuclear power plant up at Torness. And the more I learnt at the World Nuclear University, and then to Women in Nuclear, because I hold an annual conference every year, I was fortunate. I got to go to nuclear power plants and nuclear facilities throughout 7 or 8 different countries, right? As an Australian, you just don't get to see this, right? And the more I saw it, the more I thought, we need to be discussing this more in Australia. So for me, I probably started to become a nuclear advocate only maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And the reason I did it was because I realised that there is a huge gender gap in support for nuclear energy, not only in Australia, but around the world. So for me, it was like, well, we need females talking about these things, and guys as well. We need all people of all genders. But for me, I couldn't really see any women in Australia out there talking and advocating. So I did a bit of training and I started to do it more and more. And that's my story, really. I just think, for me, it's a no-brainer. I can't understand how we sort of aren't even why we have the ban to begin with. If it can't perform environmentally, economically, socially, whatever, fair enough. But for me now, at the moment, it's just about trying to raise the level of education amongst all people, anyone who wants to have a conversation. And it is part-time, and I wish it was full-time in a way, but I don't get paid a cent to do what I do. Just wanted to make that quite clear.
I think there is a stark generational, maybe not stark, but maybe a gradient. The younger you are, as a millennial myself, I never really was exposed to the message that nuclear energy equals nuclear weapons, which I think is a concern for older generations in particular. And I think it's informed the landscape in Australia on nuclear energy. I'm just interested in getting a recap, I suppose, of the state of nuclear energy in Australia and then in the rest of the world. So maybe Joe could just let us know we get told that Australia doesn't have a nuclear industry, and that doesn't sit right with me. Nuclear energy is not allowed, but we do have a nuclear industry.
Yeah, so the predecessor for ANSTO was established, I think, 70 years ago. So for 70 years, we've had nuclear science and technology expertise in this country. The Hi-Fi reactor turned 65 earlier this year, so 65 years of reactor operation. So we absolutely do. Compare that to somewhere like the United Arab Emirates, who at the start of their nuclear journey had, I understand, no nuclear expertise and are now running 3 point something, I'm sure Mark or Paris would know, gigawatts of nuclear power plants, with more to come. So we do have expertise. Would we need to scale up that expertise for a nuclear power program? Absolutely we would. But that's also bringing up our STEM knowledge, not just nuclear, but all STEM, which can only be a good thing for the country, I think.
Yeah, it's, I think, a very unambitious thing to say that we don't have nuclear energy in Australia right now, so let's not. We should be trying to build that energy capability. I'm interested in knowing the state in the US or elsewhere where you've done advocacy to, what's the state of nuclear energy?
Yeah, how about you do the overall, and then I'll fill in.
USA?
Yeah.
Well, although Australia doesn't have nuclear electricity, I mean, that's a very advanced technology, and you guys might not be at that level of development. You certainly provide brilliant young minds who are able to go overseas for good jobs that they couldn't get back at home. That's okay. Not every country is going to have advanced technology, and it might not be Australia's thing. You have very weird birds that make strange noises, and that may be your replacement for having good jobs and clean energy from nuclear. And it's okay. Different countries specialize in different things, and having weird birds is its own precious gift. But I've met great Australians who find good jobs overseas away from their home country, and I'm sure they send back remittances to you guys so you can help build the trains and stuff like that. And it's really good to see helping out like your home country that you're from. But obviously someday I think it'd be cool if you guys had proper energy too, and I certainly will look forward after this exotic and wonderful journey to your land, see if we can help you guys bring like good energy technologies to your shores too, because it's just everybody can have nuclear, especially if you have oceanside, and you've got that. So more seriously, the state of play around the world is almost everybody else but you and Germany have realized in the energy crisis that it's nuclear all the way. It's very, very few countries that have done the Australia-Germany thing where you just sit there paralyzed. In Germany, at least, the polling numbers are extremely good, but they're ultra, ultra obedient. And when the orders came down to destroy themselves and destroy their reactors, they executed it without a second thought. That's just the way Germans are. I don't know how our Australians are, but maybe you'll just bicker until your coal plants break and your grid crashes. So we'll see about that, huh? But everywhere else, even countries like Italy, it's fascinating. Italy had nuclear reactors as early as almost anywhere else in the world, and they called referenda in 1986 and 2011, where they properly voted out nuclear, doing it right as practically the molten cores of various reactors were settling into the pits. They called referenda and in a bout of emotion and fear, stripped out their own reactors. Even Italy is having a national conversation now on nuclear. I was just there a few days ago, and the Italian equivalent of MIT had like 36 students out there, awkward, nerdy students, because I guess some things are universal. And they were learning to talk to the public about nuclear for the first time as volunteers on a Saturday for no pay. They didn't even get a free meal out of it or drinks or anything. Nothing. For no reason at all, they were out there talking to people on the street about nuclear
Well, there was
energy.
a reason.
Oh yeah, they have hope for a better world and they see nuclear as the path towards it. I was just in Norway, where a really intense pro-nuclear organization has arisen. So they've got 600 volunteer advocates working with them on their membership lists in just 3 years on a per capita basis for 5 million people. You check and see what that would be like in Australia for a pro-nuclear society to have 600 times what?
Yeah,
6? 5 times more? 6 times more? That's extraordinary. In 3 years. And they're a country that is just soaked in money from oil and natural gas that doesn't really need it now for their own electricity supply. How on earth is this going to happen everywhere else but Australia? Well, we'll see. Certainly in Japan and Ukraine, 2 countries with a great deal of trauma over nuclear, multiple traumas in some ways, they're very much solidly for nuclear, from the top of the political establishment down to the people on the street. If they can be for nuclear, it's weird to hear in Australia that you can't be for nuclear because of things that happened to Ukraine and Japan. Because they're the ones it happened to. They seem to be getting over it. So, state of play around the world is mass movements everywhere towards nuclear, a rapid dropping of fear of nuclear despite scary events that ought to, under this traditional understanding of nuclear event triggering fear, that ought to be triggering more fear, like the capture and occupation of Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine. That hasn't deterred Ukraine, and it hasn't deterred the rest of Europe. So something is happening 3 generations after the events of the movie Oppenheimer. Something is happening where fear of nuclear is melting away, optimistically, because we're growing into this most advanced energy technology humans ever have harnessed, a little bit more pessimistically, because there's only so much you can fear at any given time, and our nightmares are diversifying into many other subjects, from pandemics to AI. They're just not centered around nuclear the way they were in the past. Either way, with fear dropping, optimists everywhere are discovering nuclear. Realists everywhere, post 2021 gas and energy crisis around the world, realists are discovering nuclear, which is fun too, and they're combining forces to bring nuclear to the forefront around the world. Governments that stand in their way in democracies are falling, and pro-nuclear governments are being voted back in. And it's an actual election issue over and over, which is quite interesting. There you go. There's the worldview.
Paris, did you have more to add on other parts?
Maybe I think I'd like to highlight certain ones in the U.S., but
Yeah.
maybe that'll come in the next question. I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Go for the US. I left it out.
All right.
Just
So
you.
for the U.S., as Mark stated, the energy crisis really was a pivotal point for energy. So similar to you, Andrea, millennial generation, because of the environmental anti-nuclear movement, there was an entire generation that wasn't spoken to about nuclear energy. Therefore, there was not really any fear around it. And so with this energy crisis, we had been promised that there was going to be, in some cases, 100% renewables. We were going to meet our climate and goals, and electricity prices would remain stagnant. And that's not what happened. So in California, for example, in 2020, we had the unprecedented orange skies and the fires. And then we had our first rolling blackouts, or brownouts, I'll say. And each year it keeps getting harder. So in the US, like other countries in Europe and the rest of the world, we're finding it harder and harder to add more clean generation, let's say clean capacity that actually produces and has the generation that we need, without suffering from high electricity prices, or asking users, like what we do in California, to power down between 4 to 9 peak time because we don't have enough power. So we've seen our governor in California, Governor Newsom, because he has ambitions for maybe political office later in life, that he changed his mind about saving our last nuclear plant. So instead of shutting down in 2025, we have now extended it by 5 years. And it wasn't for climate. It wasn't the reason why all the politicians had been saying that they were doing certain actions. It was because of energy reliability and energy sovereignty. We relied on 30% imports from our neighbors, pay them to take our solar during the day because we just have too much. So things have just not been working. We lost Indian Point in 2021. Which is a nuclear plant in New York, and saw immediate increase in emissions. But I'm glad to say that we have not lost any other reactors after Indian Point, and it's because it's just getting trickier and trickier to keep the lights on for people in the United States. So California saved its nuclear plant. Illinois, we did an immense campaign to save our last two, or one of the two, Byron and Dresden nuclear plants. And now we just finished the AP1000. So the only nuclear plant under construction in the US for the past 20 plus years was in Georgia. So we have now completed that. It was a very hard lesson to learn, but now we are now exporting to other countries. So the US is ready to get back in the game because Russia and China have been beating us for a little bit. So we're now seeing high interest from many sectors, from the finance sector, from those in the energy sector, those that are our tech, which Microsoft just announced their interest in nuclear. So it's looking good in the US, just like the rest of the world. And I think people are now just saying we need nuclear. It's boring. You just need it. We just have to do it. And so we're hoping to see more AP1000s or other reactors being built in the US. And advocacy has done a key role during specific timings to help push that across.
I wish this was seen as a more boring conversation. In Australia, it's very divisive. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, just saying that there's almost perfect continuity between Republican and Democratic administrations on nuclear. And depending on the way you want to look at it, kind of goes back to almost, with only a few bumps in the road, to Obama. And what other issue has that kind of, like almost every single other issue has a partisan divide in the US, and only nuclear power doesn't, which means that people exhausted from the bitter battles that they often don't even believe in, it's just like theater, like professional wrestling or whatever, they can just sit there and nerd out together on Capitol Hill about nuclear and co-sponsor each other's bills and just have an amazing time dreaming of a better world. And you get people who are convinced that climate change is a giant scam, a scientific scandal, all fakery, who are like, well, if they really believe in it, let's do nuclear. And then they actually start to have more tolerance to listen and hear about climate change science. And then you have people who have made an entire personality, even a religion, out of, beating people over the head about emissions, saying, well, if you insist on having lots of energy, it better be nuclear. Okay, so it's really uniting optimists and not just beyond optimists of all stripes in the US. And that's important because it means that we really don't have to have Australia in the game. We can just ignore you and move right beside, like you guys are a boat that's run aground in coral and doesn't have an engine anymore, and it's just like, crabs are starting to crawl over and it's falling apart in the waves. It won't slow anybody else down. I think that's amazing.
Don't leave us behind. We've got a national fear of missing out. Sorry.
I was going to say, it wasn't the case 5 or so years ago that there was bipartisan support in the US. So what happened?
I think it's just too fun. I think it's just places like Capitol Hill work in part by junior staffers with immense zeal and maybe no need to make money because they have a bit of family money and they just want to go work their asses off in DC because they're attracted to the center of power. They are coming in loving nuclear, and they're meeting young people with, again, zeal in their hearts, the zeal of the volunteer. Because utilities have never really thought of themselves as entities that have to defend nuclear or anything like that. They defend their turf, they defend their legal structures, they defend their investors, but they don't necessarily defend nuclear. But since we don't have to rely on them, if we have an immense amount of volunteers or young people like us, where I have an independent consultancy, I mean, a lot of my work benefits from the fact that I travel around the world and get really in-depth views of the energy processes and politics. Like, that helps, but it means I get to say whatever I want. I don't have a boss that can tell me not to talk about this or that with nuclear. So we're going around the utilities. Volunteers are talking to other enthusiastic young people. That's filtering up to the top of the offices of senators and congressmen. They're suddenly discovering their own nuclear industries because they wouldn't have necessarily heard about it from their own companies, and you're off to the races. So I think that's really happened too. And everything in world events just reinforces somehow, yes, we need more nuclear. Energy crisis, more nuclear. Climate change coming, more nuclear. Getting beat by Russia and China on building civilian nuclear around the world, more nuclear.
I think we do have, in Australia, you do get told by your boss what to say. If you're working in the nuclear industry, it tends to be a government job. I don't know if you want to make any comment on this. Or is no
What if your
comment
boss has told you not to say on nuclear? Could you say it? Also, your boss's name? Your Twitter handle, so we can tweet it there.
Look, I'll just agree and say it is hard for people who are working in the industry or contributing to the industry to sometimes go out and say all the things that they want to say. I think it'll change though with time.
Does that mean it's important to have people from outside the industry advocating for nuclear in Australia?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, well, we're working on it. So with the Paris, you mentioned 100% renewables and the difficulty with that, and also the reliability of nuclear and how much of a drawcard that is. So in Australia, given that nuclear is banned, it's not just an argument to justify building nuclear, it's an argument to justify changing the law, which should be easy, right? It can be done with a stroke of a pen. But we've seen the conversation so long has been around fossil fuels versus renewables. So I think in a lot of Australians' minds, clean energy has become equated with renewables, even though I don't know what it is about nuclear. Is it the stable, reliable nature of it that gets it lumped in some people's minds with fossil fuels instead of as a clean energy source that should be working with renewables to provide low carbon energy? That wasn't really a question that I've posed to you, so I guess.
Well, I think there was a.
Tell us about the vibes.
Yeah, the vibes, right? Renewables is a marketing term, and they've done an immense job of connecting solar and wind with this idea of reconnecting with nature, a way to minimize our impact. And it's a beautiful story. If you push renewables, you are this person, and this is what kind of future we can have. And I think fossil fuels, was the foundation of our societies, and then we had this like turning against them because of the emissions and what they produce. And then I think nuclear, because of the industry and maybe partly because of the backlash, I initially had this idea that it was going to be this beautiful rock, that magic rock that could provide this futuristic life. And because of the backlash from environmental movement and other factors, not that one not being the only one, I think they failed to remarket themselves. I just think it gets automatically lumped. Or like if you look on a graph, fossil fuels are like dark brown and renewables are these beautiful colors, and then nuclear is like this just shitty like orange sometimes, or like gray. And I don't, there's nobody pushing back against it. Industry, I think advocates now, I just think nobody talked about it. So therefore it's forgotten, therefore it didn't have a term.
Well, I mean, the same military discipline that gives nuclear power, it's 93, 94, 95% uptime in America. It's an absolute catastrophe when it comes to the marketing of that same nuclear. Or how about this? When nuclear is unpopular and not cool, elite marketing agencies, which of course weren't even asked to do marketing campaigns for nuclear, would nonetheless be proud to say we don't. They'd make it part of their mission statement as they go out and promote all manner of deeply unethical things that technically count as ESG. They would say, but we don't work with nuclear industry. I'm excited to see this starting to change, where it feels like marketing firms, heck, you can tell it when lobbying firms, they try to get a hold of me on Twitter and say, we're starting to do more lobbying on nuclear. And I'm like, you're not needed anymore. You're not needed. It used to be the nuclear industry barely even spent any money on lobbying, and now it can't even control its own message because the number of volunteers around the world that know why they're promoting nuclear don't have to be aligned with the board of a nuclear company or the shareholders or whatever. They have their own reason for pushing nuclear, and they've gone beyond any professional lobbying or marketing, and it's astonishing to see that whatever the vibes were, they're being reformed minute by minute online. That's why I love Twitter. the young journalists that are still working hard every day, they're on Twitter. Financial people are on Twitter. And I don't have to check in with the nuclear industry at all. I don't have to check in with their marketing team or whatever they call themselves. I can talk about what I know in nuclear. I have a degree. I can do my own math, and I can just talk straight into the microphone, straight to the public with no filters, pay nothing, take nothing to do it, just talk straight the way I see it. And then the industry has to respond to that. Not that people are waiting to hear anymore, but yeah. So all of that means that you go from a world where on LinkedIn, technically there's no nuclear category, there's fossil fuels and energy, or there's renewables and environment are the LinkedIn job categories. So like for my consulting firm, I don't even know what we put. Like I refuse to even put some title on there that says I'm fossil fuels and nuclear instead of clean energy and renewables or whatever the awful, dichotomy is. But yeah, we're changing every day, and we don't have to wait for permission or certainly inspiration from the industry itself.
One thing that might make nuclear feel like fossil fuels is that renewables, you install them and they go up in the landscape. Some people think they look bad, some people think they look good, but they use a lot of space. Whereas nuclear, you go to a power plant and you burn some fuel there, and it's the format of the jobs. But that is what provides, in some cases, a just transition for coal workers. There's going to be some specialist nuclear engineers, but a lot of the jobs are transferable from coal-fired power stations.
So, Andrea, maybe you answer it yourself why the vibes are off, why it sort of gets lumped in with, because it has fuel. Fuel that may be tiny, may last a long time, but who's seen it? No one's seen it. It may burn fuel like a coal plant. Doesn't that make it a traditional nuclear a traditional energy service? And even though you're saying it, if it provides jobs for coal workers, maybe that means it's traditional energy, right?
Yes, so I think that that does cloud the debate and the way that people see it. Like say, the vibe of the thing is are we really moving forward when we're using nuclear energy? Because it seems like something from the 50s, but that was a time when we were hopeful about the future. What happened to that hope for the future? Do you find that talking about the transition, the jobs transition, comes into your advocacy?
It's weird because I'm from the South. I'm from Oklahoma. If I go back home and get engaged in the right conversations, my accent comes out a little bit. I don't sound like the Cambridge student that got the scholarship and went far away from home across the Atlantic and, drank tea and all that other stuff. And something about the jobs transition language, even when it's a direction that I believe in and I know work, like coal plant jobs to nuclear jobs, it just always seems to come from people who may have never actually gotten their hand dirty in a job, never worked a long shift or for low pay. And I've met people who have this really intense elitist attitude. I know them outside of the public sphere. And then they're like, here's the jobs transition. Let me tell you all the jobs you can now do. And even though it is technically true for nuclear, it rubs me all the wrong way. I was working with another nuclear advocate, Maddie Hilly, on a report, our own version of a coal to nuclear transition. And we said, who are we writing this for? This isn't for Washington. What would we write if we're writing to people who are undergoing this extremely scary transition where they've put up with the ups and downs of the coal world? They're looking at the end, not just for their jobs, but their town, their whole way of life. And they're being told that there are other jobs out there, whether that be renewables or nuclear. And that was a very humbling experience to think, what is our place actually to write to people who have been considered the enemy, who people are gluing themselves to the street, calling coal people murderers, right? It's very difficult to say something that rings as true in that. I mean, here's what we found. We wanted to say, coal has made a generous, clean, safe, healthy life possible. So healthy, so rich that we can glue ourselves to the pavement and forgetting this gift. And until we say thank you and we know why we used coal, until we love coal, we cannot actually talk honestly to those involved in it and have a position of trust. And especially here in Australia, I mean, people have been throwing up that coal miner ad where they're like, don't do nuclear, it's a threat to coal. Boy, there's some bridges to be built. And honestly, there's an immense amount of distrust on the political left in Australia, I've since learned, in that nuclear is only a dishonest front for self-interested coal barons to try to slow down your bright future of renewables. So it's very difficult to talk about the jobs, and it's something we approach extremely carefully.
Yeah. So if not the jobs, what's the first point of entry to talk about the benefits of nuclear with someone who's, I suppose, for a different range of audiences?
I'll tell you, for me, it's one thing. It's very powerful. That's a little bit of a surprise to say that, because that's the very thing feared by people who are afraid of nuclear. But it strikes people as people who hate nuclear and people who love nuclear both agree with that, and you've created your first truly common ground. Well, made it clear you're not pretending that, oh, it's just a nuclear plant, it just kind of replaces coal. No, this is the most powerful force we've ever managed to use outside of hydrogen bombs, like fusion bombs. This is the most powerful force we've ever continuously used for some peaceful, good purpose. And we need to start with acknowledging that it is very powerful and that's very special. Then we can go into, depending on interest, the beauty of it or the fact that you could get jobs in it, but starting with acknowledging that's extremely powerful and thus perhaps worthy of such a bitter debate. That's a weird thing. It's worthy of a powerful split in opinion being so powerful in itself. And that's my entry point. It almost always leads straight to Chernobyl, but that's the entry point that I think is so true that it creates a pause and a little bit of peace and a little bit of white flag parlay between anti and pro.
It's very, the debate is, perhaps not surprisingly, very split along partisan lines in Australia. So we've got the Conservative Liberal National Coalition who were in power for 9 years and didn't mention nuclear at all. And now we have a Labor government who says we're not going to do nuclear. So for the meantime, while we're not up to 100% renewables, we're going to do gas. So a very overt admission that they'll be leaning on gas because they don't want to do nuclear. And the reason that comes up is it's a distraction. It's expensive. It takes too long to build.
Do they ever say it's super powerful?
They don't ever say it's super powerful.
Does the other side?
Neither side mentions that. So.
Just saying, just my little contribution as a visitor to your shores. And by the way, to uninvited, but on this Chernobyl point, I always bring up Chernobyl if my questioner doesn't do it. And what I point out about Chernobyl is it was the most powerful and destructive nuclear accident ever, and it didn't even stop the plant from staying in daily service for 14 years. What industry has its most powerful, destructive, disintegrating accident for a facility, and it doesn't even knock it out of commercial power production? It has to be bribed to turn off with 200 million from the Germans, which the Ukrainians demanded so they could turn on another reactor. That's Chernobyl? That's the most powerful accident in the history of nuclear? Anyway, you start with that 1-2 punch, and boy, you give people something they haven't heard before.
Might be a little bit spicy, but I was wondering if we should talk about the plans to transition to 100% renewables and how that is practically going to go in the real world.
Well, one of the things people ask me is they say, how can you build a nuclear plant in a high renewables environment? We may not get to 100%, but we're aiming, and everybody else is going to say we should go. So how can you build a nuclear plant as you get to 150% solar at noon in the summer, or 180% wind on a good windy winter day? And the point I make is this: nuclear and renewables don't compete half so hard with each other as renewables are renewables. Renewables are going to solve it themselves. Any storage built with renewables, if that storage is located somewhere where the people actually need energy, as opposed to banished far out to only where the renewables are out in the boondocks. That storage works for anything baseload that's nearby. So storage added to the grid in California boosts the runtime of the natural gas generators. That's right. Storage helps generators operate closer to baseload by removing them from local competition with the renewables. But the renewables still eat each other alive. So in some ways, I'm just, especially since I don't live in Australia and don't have to deal with what you guys are going to deal with, we get to sit back and watch the surface. Won't make you feel better, but will be entertaining if you're overseas. Sending money home, remittances.
Paris.
From an advocate's perspective, if I'm talking to somebody and we're citing this 100% renewable argument, I just like to rely on, I'm not going to go into the economics of it. I'm not going to go into the future. Maybe this reactor might be cheaper. If we only build 10, this would be the price. I think for normal people, it's like, what is our current landscape? And there's this beautiful website you can check out, electricitymaps.com, and you can check hour by hour where your power is coming from, and you can check it over a year long. And I think it's just important to remind people in California, we are a self-proclaimed climate leader, but yet we still rely 30% on imports and 50% natural gas. We are extending our natural gas plants every year. We keep pushing them farther and farther down the line. Are politicians lying to us? Like, what's really happening? How can we fully decarbonize when the only examples we really have come from countries that are blessed with hydro capabilities or geothermal, and then have nuclear? So I think putting all of our eggs in this 100% renewable basket, even if you love renewables, we haven't seen it work. I don't think it's very smart. And if we look at the US right now, I want to say maybe it's like 5-7%. But we put so much money in it. We can cite the Germany example, like how much money they've actually invested in, but yet they're still opening up new coal mines.
Yeah.
So I just like to stick to the real world examples and just point that nobody else has done it, and you claim to be special. You claim to be able to do it, and yet you don't even harness nuclear and advanced technology.
And maybe Australia has a ton of land, and I took a lot of flack recently by saying if anybody can do it, maybe it'll be Australia. But yeah, what we see is places that have adopted that as a goal typically have absolute ground to sky political dominance of single parties that have adopted that as not just a goal but a promise. Yet they seem to keep extending fossil fuel plants. And maybe there's some dark cabal of fossil manipulators that take these people that have campaigned their entire lives on climate change stuff and then finally achieve power and then immediately try to keep the gas plants on. Or we can say that there may be some dark secret from the grid physics people telling them they have to keep it, and that they see that any blackouts is going to rebound on them politically and destroy any chance of operating in climate change. So it might not be that, say, Albanese or whoever your leader is, he might not be corrupt on fossil fuel money that just seeps into the office of who's ever in charge. It might just be he's told, hey boss, just so you know, if we actually do what you promised, we're going to destroy the grid. I think that may be more likely what happens. Certainly it's the story in California, where I think we've been stuck at 50% gas year after year for 5, 6, 7 years, as our costs go parabolic.
My electricity prices are about 4 times higher than Mark, where he lives in Illinois, where they have how many plants? Nuclear plants?
Chicago has 4 2-unit gigawatt scale plants around it, so we're just drowning in nuclear electricity. It's cheap as heck. It's just phenomenal. Chicago is pretty much the best energy city in the world, in my opinion.
Yeah. So Paris, you mentioned the risk of pursuing 100% renewables when it hasn't been done without geothermal or hydro, and that does seem really relevant to Australia. Putting all our eggs in one basket, except our eggs are the climate and our manufacturing industries, and
all your people too,
and all our people, all our hospitals, all our homes.
The stakes are just everything. It is an experiment, but
and I do agree with what Saul Griffiths says in that if any country in the world can do it, it would be Australia. But that doesn't mean it is the best idea. It doesn't mean that it should be anything other than a last resort when we have other alternatives. I was wondering, Joe, if you had any comment on the renewables transition in Australia. We get told it's expensive, but I know you've mentioned in the past the difference between the cost to build and the price to consumers and the value to the system.
We've just heard a story about, was it 4 times the electricity cost, Illinois to California? And we see even in Australia that South Australia, I think, has the highest electricity prices.
Don't get it wrong, our power's much cleaner. So, like...
And it's actually cleaner as well, yeah? Must be.
The Northern Illinois, I can't speak for downstate, but they didn't build nuclear. So where I'm living, it's that 4 to 1, but also reverse that for the actual emissions. 1 to 4 on emissions. Yeah.
Look, I know that correlation doesn't equal causation, but we are seeing some of the most expensive electricity prices in the world happen to correlate to places with higher levels of renewables. I don't know if you guys agree, but that's what I've seen. Cases like Denmark and Germany. It's quite up there.
I think people feel it so strongly that they run ahead of the data sometimes. And I've seen people attack sloppy use of data without exactly refuting on a basic engineering level that we should be seeing such a price rise. Well, the general thing seems to be this. We're using less of the fossil fuels to balance, but if the fossil fuels, through no fault of, say, Australia's, zoom up in market price, then that's going to send cost to consumers up, but then that's only talking about wholesale costs, when in fact the amount of your bill that's just the energy building itself, it keeps shrinking because the actual cost to administer such a complicated system with double or triple built equipment being used only 50% of the time or less, those costs keep going up. I think because it's so easy to fill the story, people do run ahead of the data, and it opens up lines of attack for people who are committed to, say, data accuracy. But this is also a very dangerous situation where by the time the data is truly proven, you might have found out that this particular experiment is not fail-safe. It's fail-deadly. And so I sympathize with those running ahead of the data, even though I try to be very careful now myself.
Yeah, true. I'll see if there's just any closing statements that the panel members want to make, but when it comes to nuclear energy advocacy, how and why, what I've learned is that nuclear energy is powerful. It's powerful enough to warrant a conversation, and that should be a conversation that rests on facts, but that's not what changes people's minds. It's building this shared vision of a prosperous world and a safe and environmentally stable world that we want to see. That's what opens up those conversations. Are there any last comments from the panel?
I think to summarize everything, AUKUS is probably the worst acronym I've heard in my entire life. Like, I absolutely loathe it. Now that I've heard you guys say it, I didn't realize people were saying it. I thought it was like, you just said Australia, UK, US, or whatever. Now that I hear AUKUS, I think I'm anti-nuclear.
I think AUKUS is a bad acronym. Is the one unifying statement across all political stripes.
My serious statement then is crack a damn joke. If you're going to talk to people about nuclear, figure out their name first. Figure out where they're from. Say something funny. Be a generous host of the conversation. The biggest thing that just drives conversation they're ever going to want about nuclear, or the last one they're going to want for years. Sometimes what I'm doing is cleaning up the mess left by years of one-sided, abusive, shouting conversations. Crack a joke. Be generous. Don't take yourself so damn seriously. Do if you're operating a reactor, but not if you're only talking about them. And have a good time, and you might find that you have a much faster route to a better world.
Have you got a good nuclear joke for us?
You do your final statements. I'll come up with a real good one.
Okay, I attended the World Nuclear Association meeting a couple weeks ago, and what I will say is that nuclear resurgence is happening. The industry has never felt more optimistic about the future of nuclear, and I think, if there's ever going to be a time that we talk about nuclear and possibly get it for Australia, I think the time is now. So that gives us hope, and many other countries are doing it, and let's go ahead and use this FOMO that you guys have, like other developed countries, and get you some nuclear.
I'm going to be a boring engineer because I can't think of a joke. I would just say that we know that nuclear works, right? We've got evidence of places around the world that have installed nuclear and now have amongst the cleanest grids in the world. We don't have that same evidence in places that are aiming towards 100% renewables future. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but we know that nuclear works. And a nuclear plant that we build in 2040 could still very much be operating in 2140. So this is big focus on 2050 as some end goal. It's not. I think nuclear will be essential.
Nuclear? I hardly know her. How's that one?
Thank you, all our panel members, Mark, Paris, and Joe.